In the lecture today as well, we'll touch upon some of these themes as to what is reality and how do we really know about it. Because the question of method is intricately tied also to the question of knowledge, right? That how do we really know? What method do we employ to know the reality? Of course, to begin with, I would say that there is a conventional approach to know the reality, and which comes from liberal philosophical traditions as well, and later the positivist approach, which was quite prominent prominent as a method, which we borrowed from science, the scientific method, where it was believed that reality is out there, it is ready to be grasped, it is ready to be known, and it's objective in nature. You can't change the nature of reality. You can't change what is out there. You can't change what the reality is. The task of a researcher in the scientific positivist method was to simply apply their reason and discover this reality. So it was more about discovering what exists, and what exists is a passive object of knowledge. And I begin from here because your ethnography as a method actually take us away from this kind of a approach towards creating knowledge. If I have to say what ethnographic method does to knowledge and the formation of knowledge, in short, I would say that it actually creates knowledge which is dynamic, collaborative, more contingent, and more responsive to what we see out there. In a way, I would also argue, and this is something that you'll see in most writings on ethnography and most debates on ethnographic method, that ethnography is also something that requires a whole lot of sensitivity and a certain sensibility to be able to be carried out. Having said that, it's not an easy task to develop this sensibility, and it's a task which we always all which we are always doing. It's not like you can become a master of ethnography, or it's a method that you can just theoretically understand, and then you go out with that theoretical arsenal and do every research possible using that ethnographic arsenal. That is not how it is. The process of constant learning and the process of constantly renegotiating with your field, with the kind of reality, the ground reality that you're looking at, is what is entailed in ethnography. So let me go a little bit, and also disclaimer here, we could have an entire paper, an year-long discussion on ethnography as a method. And so today's lecture, in the 40 minutes that I've got, I'll give you like broad brush strokes of what ethnographic method would perhaps mean, and as Talim sir was saying, what its difference would be from the other methods conventionally that we are familiar with. Some of you who might come from the field of sociology in the Indian context, or even anthropology, might be familiar with these debates and might be familiar with this method, which is used a lot more in this discipline than the discipline that I'm trained in, which is political science. And as you can understand, we put the term science, which has its own history and its own trajectory and lineage. And because we claim our discipline to be so scientific, ethnography has been a very late entrant in the field of political studies or the study of politics. Now, what is ethnographic method? If you have to simply define ethnography, there is a Greek root that can help us, philologically and literally to understand ethnography. Ethnos would mean people, and grapho would mean to write. So ethnography is the writing about or of people, writing of their practices, writing of their culture. And it is a method which deploys, it's a methodology, it's a certain kind of sensibility which deploys a particular method to know and to interact with the culture of other people, and which is called participant observation, right? We'll come to participant observation in a bit, but there's a history to ethnographic sensibility. Ethnography, as we understand today in academic language and academic methodology, was not always in the academic domain. The origins of ethnography are pretty colonial in nature. It was the colonial state and its desire to know the other, the cultures that they had colonized, which created ethnographic surveys and ethnographic knowledge to begin with. It's much later, when decolonization happened, that ethnography and also the American academia and the way in which ethnography was adopted by American anthropologists in the early 20th century, that the late 19th century focus of ethnography as a colonial form of knowledge collection changed. It became much more self reflexive in the 20th century, and it became much more attuned to study culture, not necessarily of the other, but also one's own. America was a place, and the American universities, the anthropology departments in various universities was a place where we see the rise of cultural anthropologies. Places like Chicago, for instance, where there was a rise of cultural anthropology as a discipline, or Yale or Columbia, were some of these university spaces where cultural anthropologists started working and writing from the 1920s onwards. One of the major names and one of the major figures in American cultural anthropology was Bronislaw Malinowski. I don't know if you have heard of his name. Malinowski was one of the prominent ethnographers of his time. And in a book written in 1922 on the Western Pacific, a part of Australian group of islands, he wrote about ethnography, that ethnography or ethnographic form of knowledge is to grasp the native point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of his world. So, in short, what we mean by ethnography, taking off from the cultural anthropological turn in America, is how to look at the other person's world, how to look at the other person's culture, not necessarily to colonize them. May I
Yeah,
continue?
please.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So, participant observation as a method was, and which Malinowski adopted and wrote a lot about in his works. And later on, his diaries and his field notes also got published, which a lot of students of anthropology even today read, to understand how he applied ethnography as a method when he studied Argonauts of the Western Pacific, a tribe in the Western Pacific, something that was completely different from his own cultural context. He was a white American and who was going to Australia, a different climatic zone, a different cultural zone, and trying to understand people who were his other. And the idea was to stay there for a year or more, to immerse himself in the life of these people, in their world, in their practices, in their kinship networks. But not, also the idea of observation was to maintain a distance. It's not like he was a part of their kinship networks. It was not like he was a part of their ritual practices or religious practices all the time. He was someone who they also looked at as a foreigner, as an other. And so the idea was a constant interaction and engagement while observing them and while writing about them. The act of writing itself is a much debated act in ethnography, because when you write, you convert the reality of these people into a form of representation. And that representation is happening through words, through language, the structures of the language that you are using. So a lot of times, we write in academics, in dominant academics in India, we write in English. Or maybe you're writing in a dominant vernacular language in which there are journals and there are patrikas, so you're writing. But when you're writing that, let's say you're writing about a tribe or you're writing about a cultural group which is mostly oral and which has a dialect which is not really very scripted, or you're studying a tribe in Andamans or somewhere, you can't really write what they're saying just like that. Your representation is one layer of abstraction that you're doing in language. And that has been this writing of people and writing about their culture also brings a certain kind of power to the anthropologist, the power to write about them, and the power in that sense to represent them and represent their reality, but in his own structures of language. So Malinowski did not go into so much criticality at that point. He was just trying to, move away from the colonial templates of ethnography and to say that, we should not study people just because we want to rule over them and colonize them just because they are your other and you want to establish that they're inferior, which a lot of colonial ethnographic surveys did. That, oh, natives have smaller heads. They started from physiological features to saying their culture is not civilized enough. And so then there were nationalist ethnographers and nationalist anthropologists who would start saying, no, our culture is quite great. and which laid the foundation of cultural nationalism later on. So Malinowski was trying to get away from that kind of a context to produce ethnographic knowledge as an academic exercise where you're studying a culture for the sake of studying it and you're sensitively participating in its day-to-day life for almost a year. In fact, it was quite a ritual to stay in a field in one's place, the place which one is studying for almost a year. And interestingly, traditional ethnographers, whether it's Malinowski in the American context or whether it's M.N. Srinivas from India, who did a lot of village studies, in the 20th century, they'll all study a culture or a context which was outside of their own context. So the idea was that you're not studying your own city, your own family, your own village. That's not ethnography. The idea of cultural inscription and cultural writing was to study a culture that is not your own. And then the skill of an ethnographer was supposed to be the skill to go and understand the other. That has changed today, and we'll come to the change in a while. But let me also introduce you. So this was just a brief history of how ethnographic method developed. But there were two strands in ethnographic method even in the 20th century. One, a slightly older method that was coming from Europe, continental Europe, and the writings of a famous sociologist, anthropologist, Levi Strauss. And this is the structuralist tradition of knowledge creation, where it was believed that there's a structure to every society and there are certain structural truths about it. The idea of fathoming and the idea of understanding a cultural reality is to understand structures. Once you have understood those structures, and usually Levi Strauss, if you read his works, he creates binaries, he creates like diagrams, flow charts, where he says that this is the structure of a society. So in a society, there would be, there would be pure, impure. Or he has a very famous book called The Raw and the Cooked. So the idea that there is this reality and then there's this reality, these are the two structural binaries that a society has. You could be happy, you could be sad, you could be, it could be unprocessed, it could be processed. But then, or even in kinship, there are different kinds of structures. Once you have understood those structures, once you have made your notes of the structure, then you can understand all the realities and all the processes that are happening in that society. But then there was a difference that appeared in the 1970s from other anthropologists, especially Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz, who is spelled, the surname is Geertz, was writing in the 1970s. And he followed more of a Malinowskian method and suggested that cultures can't be understood just structurally. Cultures are symbolic systems. Every culture produces its own totems, its own symbols. And once you understand those symbols, you enter the life world of a culture. So you can't understand a culture, for instance, simply by understanding people's mind. You can't understand culture simply by, entering people's mind. That's impossible to do. Like if someone asks you that, oh, this person is, folding his hands and standing in front of some idol, which also you might not know is an idol, but you think that, oh, the person has folded his hands, that's a gesture. Now, how would you understand why the person is doing so? A very conventional liberal understanding would be, or a psychoanalytic understanding would be, that you should understand it through understanding the person's mind, and that could be a structural understanding of how human mind works. And so there's an abstract human mind. Then we try to understand context of that particular person, and we try to understand that, okay, the person's mind would work in this way. So you try to enter into a person's head. But Geertz would say that culture is not something that's locked inside people's minds, inside people's head. So there's no point in saying that, oh, let's deconstruct their rationality. Oh, let's deconstruct their mind and their and psychoanalyze them. But rather, culture is something that's embodied in public symbols through which members of a society communicate their worldview, their value orientations, and their ethos. So, according to Geertz, as opposed to, let's say, Strauss, for whom structures and social structures were important, for Geertzian framing of ethnographic knowledge, symbols were an entry into cultures. He also said that, culture is something that is an ethos. It's more affective. It's not really a cognitive worldview. It's not right mental. It's not something in people's mind, but it's something that is represented through gestures, through emotions, through ways in which people act out in public. So study of culture has to be from the actor's point of view, how actors are acting out, are symbolizing and creating gestures around their culture. They're constructing their culture in the process of these gestures. And this is how we make sense of their world. In a very famous essay that Geets wrote, in a book that he wrote called The Interpretation of Cultures, he wrote an essay about cockfight in, I think he went to one of the Southeast Asian countries to study, and that's where he saw cockfight happening. And he says that, think of the cockfight in the context of that place, and you have to look at how people are reacting to things. What is the placement in that society? Why is someone standing in front? Why is someone standing at back? Why is someone winking? We wrote an entire paragraph, perhaps like 2 3 paragraphs, just on the idea of a winking in public during a cockfight. So the idea of cultural ethos was something that was very important. And that brings me to a more general question, and which, we'll be talking about more now, is how in ethnographic research, so after all the intellectual history, now let's come to how conducting ethnographic research could be different from other kinds of research. In ethnographic research, what is important is not how you frame reality, what preconceived notions you have about reality, because that is, again, falling back into the folly of objective knowledge, to go back into this conception that knowledge is universal, everyone in the world should have the same kind of sensibility. That is not what ethnographers would say. Ethnography would actually be sensitive to difference. It'll prioritize meanings and frameworks that are outside of your own worldview, that are outside of your own, sense of what is truth, what is right, what is real. And it's not always based on, pre-existing scholarship also, because pre-existing scholarship might be using conceptual frameworks that they have gathered from their research, not necessarily always grounded, not necessarily always contextual. Sometimes, when we write as academics, we cite each other and we cite famous philosophers. Let's say in political science, very often when we write about state or when we write about sovereignty, we are also quoting Hobbes or Locke or, the famous canonical philosophers who we have read, and we just want to say how we are different or we are similar to their framing. But that is not the kind of research and writing that one would expect from ethnography, because ethnographic writing does not only pay obeisance to a disciplinary tradition, and it should not ideally, and more so today, it is believed that ethnography is also deconstructing the conceptual frameworks that already exist, and they're also trying to prioritize meanings and realities that are being gathered from different contexts. So knowledge is not produced from above, in simple terms. Knowledge is not produced from outside a world, and we are not just applying, let's say, a theory to a world that you are studying and to a field that you are studying, but the theory will emerge from the field, from the ethnographic encounters. And ethnographic encounters will also be, long term encounters. It's not like you go to a field today, you talk to a person, you take that person's interview, even unstructured, so as to say, and you will be done with ethnography. No, that's not how it is supposed to be. And ethnographic research is not just about collecting oral narratives or collecting, uh, an interview, even unstructured, but it is about observing, it is about living in a situation, maybe going there again and again and again, to to fathom what the life is like in that situation. In Hindi, we have this term, no, atmasat, which means that you actually just absorb and immerse yourself in a reality. And that is the reason why it's also very immersive as a methodology. Unlike a methodology like a survey, where you go with a questionnaire which is pre-decided based on pre-decided conceptual framing, you just want your respondent to fill in the blanks, to fill in the questionnaire, and that's your job done. But in ethnography, you're not going with a preconceived sense of questions. Even if you go with a preconceived framework, and sometimes the respondents or people that you're meeting will start speaking in a very different language and maybe using frames that you don't even think will be a part of your research. And that is the reason many a times ethnography leads you to collect more data than you're even aware of at the time of doing fieldwork. Ethnography many times lets you fathom and lets you think about so many things at the same time, simultaneously, through multiple senses, not just through speaking, but also the smells, the voices you were hearing, the gestures, or what you feel. I'll just relate an experience of my own when I was doing, my ethnography in Jaipur. And I went with a question. I was a student at JNU at that time, and I went with a question, a research proposal, which was passed by the department, which was on heritage and how heritage economy is becoming important in Jaipur. So I was trying to understand the heritage, meanings of heritage, and how people attach different kinds of importance to heritage. So I went and I spoke to someone who was an old bookseller in the city, and I talked to him and I said, "So, what do you think about heritage conservation in the city?" Now, if I had some training, and which is very difficult to get without going to the field, I would have not asked this question to begin with. Maybe I would have just struck a conversation about his time in the city, maybe let him talk more than me talking. That would have been much more productive. But what I started doing instead was I tried to talk to him through the frames that I had created. And you know what he told me? He told me, आप जो लेकर आए हैं सब गलत है. आप लोगों का तो एक अलग आप और he said he has met many students before, especially from JNU, and he said that you people use very difficult language and you don't know the original reality. And this was interesting. In my critical rational mind, when I went as a researcher, young researcher, I was like, what is rational and what is this objective reality? There's no original reality, there's no original plan. But then for him there was something like an original plan of the city. And so, first I dismissed it. Many meetings just went where I was very dismissive. I was also kind of thinking that I'm wasting my time talking to this person. He was talking about different kinds of things that I never even imagined. Like, let's say, tantric traditions. I never thought that is a part of my research. So I kept dismissing it. It's like when you're making notes, sometimes you just think, "Ah, this is not important. Let's just put it in the margin." Or let's not even put it in the margin. Forget about it. And then when I started introspecting, also talking to friends help, who are also doing ethnographies at the same time, or talking to other people, sounding it out and feeling, so I was just telling my irritation to a friend, a co-researcher, and I started saying that, I feel very uncomfortable when he starts talking about these things. And then the person said that maybe, we are just looking at him from our lens. And it was very true. I was dismissing him because I had a very rational, educated, very kind of sophisticated theoretical lens, perhaps, which was not needed. I was just imposing that lens on the reality to study. And what he was trying to do was tell me his reality, his perceptions, his interpretation, which for me were useless to begin with. But then the idea is, and that's why I use this example, is when you enter a field, you might have shocking revelations. You might not like certain things because you feel, oh, this is too conservative. Oh, this is too religious. Oh, this is not politics at all. Why am I even looking at it? But that is where we commit the mistake. The idea is, and let's remember the line again, and this I've taken from an essay by Meg Granen, who has herself done a lot of ethnographies. She says, you always collect more data than you even register at the time of doing field work. And the nature of data in ethnography is not oral, it's not always interviews. That can be, but that's not it. That's not the only data that you gather during ethnography. It's also multi-sensory in nature. It's also about how you feel, your emotions, and there should be a separate diary that you should have just to have a journal while you're doing field work in terms of how you're feeling today. Sometimes, I always had that experience that when I go to the field, I am prepared to face a lot of different kinds of people who are not necessarily people who I would otherwise interact with. When I would come back, I would take a bath, I would be in the comfort of my home, and then I would think it felt like I had washed away the field from my body. So no, it's a very embodied experience. It's something that you feel like the field is still sticking to me, or the field has just gone and I'm in a different reality. But then the idea is, when you're writing in that pristine reality of your home after taking the bath, that writing will be very different from the writing that you're doing feverishly in the field, in that dusty auto, in a ride that you're changing from one spot to the other, or maybe the walks that you're doing. You should definitely have, and today people record, they do videography. There are different kind of instruments and technologies that are now mediating ethnographic data collection too. So, sometimes voice recordings to one side while you're walking could also help you understand how you were really feeling at that particular time. Obeisance and prioritizing pre-existing meanings and conceptual frameworks, which are disciplinary in nature, but they are always trying and striving to create new kinds of conceptual frames, sometimes also creating breakthroughs in disciplinary frameworks, creating more interdisciplinary kind of knowledge at times. In this way, ethnographic research, as I said in the beginning, is contingent, more sensitive, more responsive, and dynamic, rather than being static, fixed, and theoretically laden. No, and the other difference that ethnography has with, scientific objective method is that there's no hypothesis testing by this in this method, because hypothesis testing makes sense if you are working in a paradigm, where someone has given a particular uh, representation of reality, saying this is objective. Now contest if you can. And then you try to say, okay, my hypothesis is different, and let me now have a method to suggest. So sometimes we can do qualitative research for hypothesis testing also, but in ethnography, there's no necessary hypothesis testing. Also, ethnographic knowledge always lends itself to creating new categories of knowledge. At times, your respondents' words, their language, their framing of reality will be more important than your own framing of reality. So, never put yourself in a position of power and authority when you're doing ethnographic research, because then you'll be committing a mistake in terms of being in a position of power above everyone else and not paying heed to what they are saying. The idea is to listen rather than to speak more. Concepts have to emerge from inside your field, not imposed from outside. Material in ethnography and data in ethnography is not just something that's a case or an example. In fact, there are many pedagogues and teachers of ethnography anthropology who have been writing. So, Meg Grahanen is one such person. She teaches in a Canadian university. She's a trained, anthropologist come historian from USA. She did her PhD from Columbia, and she writes a very interesting piece on her teaching of ethnographic method to a class of UG students in Canada. And she says that, can it really be taught? Can ethnography be really taught theoretically in a class? And she says that there are different activities that she would do in order to create what she says an ethnographic sensibility among the students. Because, ethnography is always an experiential form of knowledge. Until you experience the field, it's very difficult for you to understand the categories of knowledge that you want to use. It requires narrative strategies and writing to reflect and represent your field. And the more sensitive your writing and your language is, the more sensitive your choice of words is, the better you will be able to represent your reality, even though representation itself is abstracting. But even then, you will be able to. And so nowadays, we also see, different modes of representing ethnographic data, maybe through videos, films, ethnographic films, sometimes even through very raw material that you get from the field. So just field videos, sometimes through, design templates are also now being used in order to represent what ethnographic data is saying rather than using words. So writing and representation becomes an important part of ethnographic method. In fact, many a times when I talk about ethnography to my students, I say that if you can't write well, or if you can't, if you're not invested in the process of writing, then ethnography is not a method for you. And so writing, and this is something that James Clifford and George Marcus have written in their book Writing Culture, that writing becomes a central aspect of ethnographic research, and that creates also a discourse about culture. So again, the idea of knowledge in ethnography is not simply a one-dimensional knowledge. It's not oral history, it's not just oral narratives, it's not just unstructured interviews, but it's much more than that. It's something you can smell, hear, and sense So a good ethnographic description is when you read it or when you see it, when you can also smell it, hear it, and sense the field on reading a good ethnography. You don't need to be in that field. You might never have visited, let's say, Western Pacific, or you might not have visited Nepal, or maybe, a particular city in America. But when you read about it, you'll get a sense of it. You'll understand characters there. And let me end, the lecture now with the elements of ethnography that were written about in the 1970s and 80s in the works of Clifford Geertz or, Marcus and James Clifford. And they would say that what is the form of ethnographic writing? And this is in the 1970s and 80s that we are talking about. They say that there are 9 elements to how ethnography has to be written. Number one, the narrative structure has to be there. You create a story from your field and you write about that. So narrative is important, narrative building is important, and something which is very similar to writing history. Historians and historiographers have also talked about narrative building, plotting, etc. So these are the devices of writing that you use in ethnography. Secondly, they feel, all of these 1970s and 80s anthropologists, that unintrusive presence of ethnographer is needed. The voice of the ethnographer, their own feelings were kept to a minimal in the conventional ethnographies of that period. Number three, people. When you represent and talk about people, you talk about them in terms of abstract denominations, like you talk about them rather as a collective, this community, or these groups, or this kinship relation, like a sister-in-law or a mother-in-law. They are the ones that you talk about. You don't make them into individual characters with their quirks and eccentricities. You talk about them as if people is a common denominator that you find in the field. Number four, ethnographic data produced in the field and field work is what becomes the basis of writing. So field work becomes important for collection of ethnographic data and writing as well. Number five, the focus of ethnographic research and writing has to be everyday life and situations. So it's case studies, yes, of particular places and particular lives, but it's not just a case study, because you're not trying to justify a universal truth here. You're also trying to produce and interpret particular kind of questions emerging from a particular context. Sixth, emphasis on native point of view is very important. Not your point of view, but the native, so-called native point of view. Seventh, establishing sufficient context is important in ethnographic writing. You can't just randomly say, this person talked to me about this, his views were this. But what is the context? When was the person saying this? What was the year? What was the condition of when you're talking to that person? Were you in the middle of a street? Were you sitting at a home? Were you drinking tea? So the context establishment is very important for specifying and making any generalizable claim. Next, use of disciplinary jargon to signal anthropological competencies and scholarship. That there are certain anthropological competencies, like spending time on the field for 1 year. Talking about Malinowski's method, like participant observation, would become ways to say that we are also doing anthropological research, and you justify your research by paying obeisance to already existing disciplinary jargon. And lastly, contextual exegesis of native concepts and discourses, that whatever the natives are telling you, their concepts and their discourses have to be contextualized. After this, these are the major conventional ways of writing ethnographic research. In 2012, another list was produced in a class that was led by McGranen, in the UG class that I was talking about, where she was trying to, instill ethnographic sensibility in her students. And she says that when I asked my students to prepare a new list where they had to say what has changed in ethnographic writing today, they actually added 3 new things. They changed 3 things. One, the major change is that ethnographer's voice should be present in ethnographic writing. Ethnography has become more auto-ethnographic, or rather we can say ethnography has become more self-reflexive. Sometimes our own biases can creep in the way we choose to enter the field. Sometimes we might be more self-conscious in the field and we might choose our respondents accordingly. Our gender, our caste, our language can play a role. our projections, our dressing can play a role in how we are looked at in the field. Our position, our feelings, our vantage point becomes important in ethnographies today. And so, ethnographer, as to the process of how did we create a network of knowledge, how did we meet our respondents, what was our process of entering the field, and how do we know what we know, what were the ways in which we deployed, what were the ways we deployed to get the responses. So sometimes, you have to dress a particular way in your field to make your respondents speak to you. Like if you go up, so I'll give you another example. I had once gone, and that was long back, 2012, when I had started my fieldwork. I'd gone in Jaipur to watch a procession, a royal procession of Tej, which is a festival there. And I wanted to sit in a place where the white tourists were sitting, because that was the state organized spectacle. So I wanted to sit there. But I was carrying a local shop's plastic packet, which it was a matching center. And any local person would go there, cheap looking, very garish perhaps. And so the guard, who was also this local person, he said, "You can't go there, it's only for tourists." So I said, पर मेरे को देखना है, फ्री है एंट्री, तो क्यों नहीं जा सकते? And then I was talking Hindi. And then I thought, okay, let me, so I wanted to then explain to him that I am also maybe like a tourist. So I spoke in English, and I also kind of said, I want to meet your officers. And so he got a little scared, and then he told me, okay, I'll call someone. And then someone came. Again, I spoke in English, and then they gave me entry to the white tourist place from where they were watching the procession. So what I'm saying is sometimes self-fashioning and being aware of your situation in the field is very important in ethnographic writing. I'll just end with two more points. The second point that the students added was how people that you're writing about in ethnographic research are not simply common denominators, a collective, but there are also characters who emerge while you do your research. So, it's like writing a storybook sometimes, a fiction. And so the gap between fiction and reality might look very narrow. But the idea that there are these characters that you meet every day. Sometimes you say, no, oh, this person is a character, but you characterize, you figure out why is this person like this. To write individual narratives like they are characters, and developing them over the course of your writing is something that has also emerged as important. And the other thing that is very important is how the sense of ethnographers' relation with the community and how is the trust gained, how is the relationship forged, needs to also come in your writing. So to end the entire discussion, as I said that it's a never-ending discussion and a lot can be done in terms of teaching, exchanging ideas about ethnography. But I'll just end with this point that the research topic that you choose for an ethnographic research and the research that you conduct as a in using ethnographic methodology has to be in dialogue and collaboration with the cultural context and the people and your respondents who you're meeting in the field. There's no knowledge which is above, there's no knowledge which is objective, and there's no reality which you can understand without the contact or without your participation and intimate participation in the field. So observation is never from the hill. Observation is never from above. Observation is not really objective in that sense, but observation is always intimate, participative, and collaborative in ethnographic research. And this is what makes it extremely different from other kinds of positivist methods, making it a part of post-positivist methodology. So I'll end here, and maybe we could do a little more in case there are questions. Thank you so much for your observations and your question. And it is quite an interesting example, Ashish Nandi, because to my mind, Ashish Nandi falls because he he's very interested in understanding the psychopathologies of post-colonial period, right? And the way in which the mind of the colonized worked. And in that process, the way we interpret our traditions and our cultures also. So definitely for him, mind as a category remains quite central and important. And a lot of what he talks about traditions and culture is also something that he analyzes through the mind. So for me, definitely, I mean, I would not say he's an ethnographer, but he might have an anthropological understanding of how cultural difference, how cultural negotiations were taking place in the post-colonial context, or in our striving for modernity even during reforms period or nationalist period. So I would maybe place him there. uh, but what I also find, and so moving a little away from Ashish Nandi per se, what I also find important to highlight here is that ethnography will not give much primacy to the mind as a source of knowledge, as you have already said as well. Because mind and the humanism based on the mind comes from the Enlightenment period. It's very Eurocentric form of knowledge as well. When we think about knowledge which is native or which is coming from, let's say, ground up, there might be different registers of that knowledge. Could be affective or emotion laden. It could be embodied, body centric. In fact, the native was seen as mindless but body. And that is how the colonizer would look at the native. The colonizer had the mind. So we are also trying to, as an ethnographer, one also tries to uh, upturn this logic of power and tries to reclaim bodily knowledges, affective knowledges, to suggest that it's not just the sovereignty of the mind that we need to talk about. So, mind is not the primary category for ethnography, uh, in my understanding. And so I would say that yes, Ashish Nandi's work on culture and traditions is anthropological perhaps, but not ethnographic. Right. I mean, he would still work with a lot of mega categories, and a lot of those things like traditions, let's say, uh, and maybe more structural in nature than deconstructive. So that would be my very tentative response, because I'll also have to think about it. And it's an interesting question that you posed. Should I take questions of the interns from the
Yeah,
box?
yeah, yeah. Please, please, please.
Okay. So Saloni asks, ma'am, could you please elaborate a bit more on the point of using disciplinary jargon in writing? So, Saloni, I was just trying to say that many a times in academic writing, in order to justify ourselves, and this is also the politics of publishing in general, which is also, related to who you cite, who you should cite. Many a times reviewers will say, oh, you have not cited this literature that. So the idea is to engage with literature in your field, and that is what defines your disciplinary boundaries. I'm working on a city, so I should be writing about so and so. I should be citing this person, otherwise, my work will have no meaning in this academic field. So, we use disciplinary jargon sometimes to pay obeisance to already existing conceptual frames, and sometimes we use the same conceptual frames and apply them. So, if so someone has written in that essay only, McGranon's essay only, something interesting was written. She says that, someone who is applying Deleuze's idea of nomadism and then going to the field to study the nomads is not really doing ethnography. You're just applying a concept and imposing it somewhere. But if you're starting from the nomad themselves, then you are actually doing ethnography. So disciplinary jargon can be very limiting at times, Saloni. The need is to break out of disciplinary jargons, otherwise we might not do creative research at all at times. We might get, very, so as Sir was saying, we don't have poetic possibilities in a conventional research, but if you are trying to move beyond the discipline and disciplinary language, you can create your own language and your own form of writing. And that is important in ethnographic writing today. Right? I hope I'm clear. If you have, you may please write any like cross question if you have anything to ask further. The next is Manish, but I don't think it's a question. It's just transcribing the call. So I'm not thinking of this as a question. Swastik, when we are in the field, sometimes we didn't get the context of their point of view. How should we deal with it? It takes time to understand it, but how we diversify our views to understand them? Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, you're asking how do we understand their context? If we are talking to someone, let's say, and we ask them about, let's say, Delhi elections, आपको क्या लगता है इस बार कौन जीतेगा, और आपको क्या लगता है केजरीवाल जी ने कैसा काम किया है, And then the auto wala or the person you're talking to will start talking to you and start, saying, बहुत अच्छा काम किया. And then the next auto wala will tell you, एकदम ठीक नहीं है, सब कुछ बकवास है, दूसरा पार्टी आना चाहिए. So what I'm saying is sometimes the same city, the same people, maybe you'll treat them both as residents of Delhi and maybe both are voters, but they'll have different views. Now the point is, why are they so different? So you'll have to then dig a little deeper. You'll have to understand a little bit more. And these things come through conversations. To begin with, the conversation is an icebreaker. If you are too upnosed and you're not talking, you won't even know what people are thinking. So the idea is to go down, talk to people in their language, and try to understand what they are thinking and why they are thinking. Not to judge. Yeah, that's another thing one should be very careful about in ethnography. You might have a different ideology for all that matters. But in your field now, don't bring your ideology in play. Try to keep it apart from your encounters. It's difficult, but you should be reflexive. You should know when your categories are clouding the conversation, when you are speaking more and listening less. And so, context has to be developed slowly over conversations. And sometimes you can understand it in one conversation also, at least broadly. Narrowly, you need to understand it through several encounters. And so, ethnography, as I said, is a slower method compared to, let's say, a survey or just filling a questionnaire. And how do we diversify our views? I would say, if I interpret it, I would say that we have to be sensitive and we also have to be open minded when we go to the field. We can't be narrow in our own concerns and our own views. Then we won't be able to get a very diverse response too. And sometimes, if the response is too diverse, your point is to understand that diversity and then to find respondents from groups and sections that you feel would give you a particular point of view. And then these are the ways in which you corroborate what one person has said. So that is what I would say to your question. Anyone else who would want to ask and write the question? Secondary research will help in it. Yeah, so some of the references, I can share it with Talim sir if that's allowed, and you could read some works on ethnography. In fact, the best teacher of ethnography is ethnographic writing and reading different ethnographies, so you get a sense of how people conduct their research. Because every field, if you're working, let's say, in a city on a underworld, on a criminal network, it'd be a very different research, also risky. If you're working on a political research looking at elections, it'll be a different ethnography. If you're looking at whatever, like, so different researches will be different and you need to read more to understand more. Now I don't see any more questions at the moment, so
Yeah, Garima, thank you very much. You have
thank you.
delivered a very interesting, very systematic explanation of ethnography, its history, and the conceptual, underpinnings. So that's very important, and of course, it was uh, so much, interesting and systematic that the students would lead one more, discussion on this. So we'll be engaging them in discussion, and they'll also participate in
Yeah.
some research studies later.
Yeah.
So I have a small query which
Mm-hmm.
always comes in my mind that when we study ethnography, then start with Melovansky, then
Mm-hmm.
Strauss, and then Clifford Gage,
Mm-hmm.
and then so on. So what about Indian ethnographers? So we have only one M.N. Srinivas. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we start from him and then in there only. So
No, I
my
mean,
yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
so connecting to one more point. So
Mm.
we have MN Srinivas. Then who are the later Indian ethnographers we could also go through and take their point of views so that
Mm.
we can think about, because we need to within India we have different linguistic, political,
Mm-hmm.
cultural, sociological
Mm-hmm.
category spaces. So
Mm.
to in order to understand Rajasthan, I don't know
Mm.
Rajasthani, so it will
Mm-hmm.
be a kind of ethnographic work for me. So are there ethnographers to whom we
Yeah.
can look at? And secondly, when we look at the colonial times, basically the
Hmm.
early starting from early 20th
Hmm.
century,
Hmm.
so Tilak to Lohia.
Hmm.
So how do we conceive them, or should we only read them as the political thinker or social reformer, or should we also have some idea to think about how they were actually doing
Hmm.
ethnography?
Hmm. Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, so
Yeah.
how to, yeah,
Hmm.
so that way, yeah.
Thanks. And I'm not a trained anthropologist, but I've read on my own, and I was in Yale for a year where I was kind of associated with the anthropology department, did some courses. So I only gathered whatever I know of anthropology from, this. But the question of Indian anthropology, in fact, there is a book that I would recommend called Anthropology in the East. Because many a times, because anthropology had such colonial origins, it was Western, Eurocentric. And they used their frame to study the Oriental, the other cultures. The post-colonial ethnographers and post-colonial anthropology, just like post-colonial historiography, was critical of those European frames and created their own studies of India, Indian village life, Indian folklore. So, of course, M. Srinivas is the oldest sociologist we know who did this, use this method. But we have a lot of, mid 20th century, also some who were engaged in ethnographic research right from the days of nationalist movement. So many physicists, scientists, even P.C. Mahalanobis did anthropometric research. But all of that, and even the oldest anthropology departments in our country, in India, till around early 20th century, even Calcutta University, which had the oldest anthropology department, was physical anthropology. So they would do a similar kind of anthropology which colonial rulers had taught them, which is to measure heads, look at evolution, look at human beings, how they evolved from, let's say, apes, that kind of a narrative. But to study culture, cultural turn in anthropology in India came after 1960s, 1970s, similar to the subaltern turn that came in historiography. And then we had the Delhi School of Economics and Sociology, where there were many, there are scholars who did wonderful ethnographies. Roma Chatterjee, who worked on folklore in Bengal's context. Rajasthan, there's a very interesting person called Komal Kothari. He's more of an oral historian, but he has been collecting folklore and narratives. There have also been literary reinterpretations, and there is an ethnography that happens of discourse and literature also. So Vijayadan Detha's works are there in Rajasthani language, which is of course written in Devanagari script. So a lot of oral traditions were also talked about in Rajasthan's context. But again, critical and self-critical ethnographic research was not so much about the village or the folk, because folk was still the other of the urbane educated class. Today, ethnography has moved into the direction of studying ourselves, our cities, our own, cosmopolitan context. So there are ethnographies of shopping malls. Sanjay Srivastava has done that, or elite schools, or even urban ethnography, which I mostly engage with. There's a whole lot of literature on urban ethnography in India today. So today, the field of ethnography has become quite multidisciplinary as well. There are works on embodied experiences, on smells, on religion, of course, one of the pet topics even earlier in folklore too. But now we have moved into the non-conventional domains of ethnography also. And in the process, just like, post-colonial theory tends to create its own set categories, subaltern historiography created its own lens to look at marginal narratives and other voices or small voices of history, as Ranajit Go says. Similarly, ethnography is emerging from the non-European context also created their own interesting sensibilities and ways of understanding and knowing a place. So that would be my way of at least looking at it. To come to your second question about, can we look at thinkers, political thinkers like Lohia or even Gandhi, to my mind, it was coming when he was speaking, who had his own ashrams, and he had a lot of experiments in those ashrams as ethnographers. And I would be tempted to say, yes, I mean, they are the people who worked on the ground with people. Maybe they had ideological lens when they wrote. So they were coming from particular parties or particular ideologies, and which were very polemically represented in their writings. But a lot of their politics on the ground and experimentation is something that reflect a sensibility that is ethnographic, not always self-critical though. So that would be my very short response, but I think it gives a lot of food for thought to us, and especially to create a kind of collaboration between political science and theory, and how we look at post-positivism, ethnography, and we are trying to question the categories that exist. So how do we read Gandhi differently, or how do we look at Gandhi? So let's say when I was a student in political science, conventionally we would have theoretical texts which would interpret Gandhi and his philosophy. He was a philosopher. But I was also then reading a lot of interesting histories of Gandhi about his food, his dietary practices, even his sexual experiments, and his bodily practices. So I think those open up a whole new arena. Ajay Sakaria has a very interesting work on Gandhi's ashram as a practice of life. So I would say those kind of literature, so we need to interact with that literature more, but that does exist, at least for some philosophers, and Gandhi is one of the most prominent ones, but not sadly for many others. So we are also kind of confined within our own bubbles.